the Dream 100 Show. The epicenter of influence, collaboration, and exponential growth. You're about to discover the power of relationships. Dream 100 relationships. And you're one relationship away from a totally different business and life. This is your host, Michael Tesner.
So how do you figure out where to put your money? I had a very, very interesting call this morning with a public company that is very large, obviously due to non-disclosure agreements. I can't give you the company name, but we talked about a subject that in marketing spend for small business typically doesn't get talked about enough. And that is attribution. So I wanted to kind of give you a few layers and just some actionable steps so that at the end of the day, you can have more confidence as to where to allocate your budget. Now, my disclaimer with all of this is that I tend to be more nimble. What I recommend to you on this Dream 100 show is that as you see something working well, I want you to do more of it. I don't want you to say, well, my budget is capped at $1,000 a month for Facebook ads, but I blew through that budget in 4 days, but it produced $50,000 in profitable sales, for example. I can't invest anything more than $1,000. You have to be able to be nimble about this stuff. But at the end of the day, most businesses need some layer of budgeting. They need some type of strategic plan so you can look out the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months and say, here's the budget that I'm allocating at this stage. Now, I've also talked in the past about budget allocation and what percentages to use. This is not going to be that episode. If you want to go back, you can listen to that episode. I'll link it in the show notes. But a general rule of thumb is that most businesses are investing between 5 and 10% a month of their gross projected, keyword projected sales. So if you're projecting to do $1 million in revenue this year, you should be budgeting $50,000 to $100,000 of that gross number back into marketing. Now, I'm not going to go on a tangent because that episode tackles all of those, whether you think that number is high or low. It varies by industry, and there's a lot of different ways to actually pick the number. But I'm going to assume that you've already got a number picked. So let's do simple math and say you're going to tell me that your budget is $120,000 a year. If it was allocated evenly, you would put $10,000 every single month. Now, with everything, I want you to have a little bit of layered seasonality. So you might scale back in some of the months and scale up in other months. So that number can obviously move a little bit throughout the course of the year, but we're going to talk about how I would allocate, but most importantly, how would I figure out how to allocate that $120,000 investment? So, attribution and modeling. Now, I'm going to do my best to not get so in the weeds on this topic because it's one that I can kind of geek out on, but I don't want to get so kind of in the weeds that you're like, oh, Michael, that made no sense to me, and I've got to figure out a way to actually get this stuff sorted out. So there's a few different schools of thought when it comes to modeling and how you kind of allocate or figure out how to allocate. So the one that I'm going to laser in on is called MTA, or multi-touch allocation. This also can be referred as attributing first in and last in, for example. And what you're looking to do here is you're looking to back into whatever you're selling, the product or service. You're looking to be able to track where that particular prospect heard about you first, Where did they go second, maybe third, fourth, fifth, and then what put them over the edge? So if I look at first in versus last in attribution, and let me just give you a very simple example. Let's say that you're selling used cars. You're a buy here, pay here dealership. So you have this ability to bring people in and you can finance them. Very interesting business model that I happen to know a lot about. Now, you might have some ads that are running. Maybe they're on Facebook. Maybe they're on, if you're a bigger dealership, maybe you're using things like Hulu or TV ads or radio ads. And a customer might hear your brand name. They might hear about you on one of these places for the first time. And if we're setting up proper tracking, and that means having access to a lot more data, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, having unique tracking websites, tracking phone numbers, you could track and see, great, that radio ad resulted in them hearing about us, and then they took this next action. But you'll be able to back into knowing that that was their first interaction. Last in attribution would then be as they decide to actually come into the dealership and make a purchase. So maybe they hear about you on the radio and they visit the website, but maybe they don't actually fill a form out. But 3 weeks later, they see a Facebook ad and they click that Facebook ad and they go to the website, they fill a form out, and now in your customer relationship management system, it most likely will then show, unless it's intelligent enough, that Facebook ads was that particular lead source, because that last in thing, that thing that pushed them over the edge, is what drove the sale. The way that I want you to analyze this data before you start to allocate is using two different layers. The first one is what we just talked about, and that is using kind of multi-touch and looking at, even if you're looking at first in and last in attribution. So I'm like, why would I not just focus on what drove the sale? Like, why wouldn't we just say Facebook ads? If all these last in sources say Facebook ads, why wouldn't I just put all my money there? Well, the issue is, if everyone heard about you somewhere else, if they visited the website first and they came from organic, if they got a postcard, if they saw you at a trade show or at an event, if they were geofenced, if there was something else that has contributed in that process, I need to track it. I need to know the different touch points. Now, for me, to simplify for small biz, I love to look at the first in and the last in. What's the first place they heard about us? What's the thing that put them over the edge to become a paying customer or to purchase something on the website? And you can add other layers to that and say, well, I only want to look at 30-day attribution, for example. You can look at 3 years worth of data and say, well, they saw us 3 years ago at XYZ trade show that was overseas, but our Google ads are what would put them over the finish line. So the more data you have, that's going to be the common denominator here. The more data that you have, the better you can start to allocate your budgets. Now, in just a minute, I'll give you some feedback if you don't have any data, but you should be able to look at some conversion data. Conversion data is what I'm looking for you to track down. This should be inside of your Google Analytics accounts, for example. You should be able to see this stuff in Locker Studio and start to build out some reports. Or if you're an e-com company, you should have more higher levels of software. Hyros is a really great tool. Adobe has their tracking and attribution, though it's very expensive, typically for most small biz. But I need you to have some data as a starting point so that you can start to analyze it. Before we start to make any marketing decisions on what's good or what's bad, we need to analyze this data. Now, the other way that you can start to look at attribution and figuring things out is called MMM. And in this model, I'm looking more at the macro level. If I'm looking at your sales, were there any macro things that potentially affected positively or negatively your sales. Now, the most easy one for me to name would be the pandemic or COVID. Certain businesses took a nosedive, like movie theaters, for example, and we can easily point to that. Other businesses, maybe ones like pharmacies, they skyrocketed up. So we can start to look at kind of the macro trends. We can look at seasonality. We can look at the competition. So we can get more of that macro level of what's happening on the outside. And we can start to leverage that data to have us put our dollars in a better spot. And what we found that gives you the best results is when you take some macro data like that and you combine it with attribution data. So here is what this would look like. So the business that I referred to earlier, they are a theme park. And there's multiple theme parks. So I would put them in the basket of being a family entertainment complex. So from a macro level, if I was looking at analyzing the last 12 months, I could look at were there any external factors, were the election, did that affect anything? Certain seasonality, were there any big weather events? Did something happen with the competition? Like I can start to look at all of that and plot it. And then I can take and look at our conversion data and start to go deeper and deeper with the actual data and look at attributing multi-touch, first in, last in. Now this gives you very good starting places so that you can figure out, rather than just saying, well, let's do everything that we did last year, let's just do it the same. This is going to give you some weights that you might see, well, 70% of the last in is coming from Google AdWords, and we're only budgeting X. Well, what if you were to actually increase your Google AdWords budget? You're going to start to see some of the first in. Well, maybe more of your first in is all coming from a billboard that you thought was a complete waste of money. You have to make sure you're taking all these different things into account. If you only look at it black and white, this is one of the biggest marketing mistakes that I see people make. They look at it in black and white and they say if they can't attribute hard dollars, cut it. But they completely forget that, well, that helped the sale. That helped maybe get them 25% of the way closer. Or that was the first place that they heard about us. So you might not be able to perfectly track all these billboards, but when you start to look at other data, again, data that we're looking for, you start to paint a very different picture. So I would take that data and I would start to plot what you did last year, look at the budgets that you did last year, what are you forecasting for this year, and then start to make some tweaks off of the attribution data. I always like to leave at least 10% for testing new platforms and new creative. But if I've got a good starting point, why would I also completely throw everything out the window? If your business is incrementally growing, unless it's completely going sideways or down, you don't just completely throw out your playbook from last year. You take the playbook, you dust it off, you continue to improve it and get better. The kiss of death is making critical changes also when you're right at your season or right in the busy time. You don't want to just completely reverse course. Dust it off, but leverage all of this macro data from an MMM standpoint, and then leverage first and last in attribution to see where you should weight some of your sources a little bit higher. Maybe I should scale up on Facebook, scale back on TikTok, scale up on Google AdWords, scale up on organic and SEO, but scale back on radio, for example. So that is what I would do if I had some good data that was set up. You have the conversion data and you can give me some good, accurate data. If I didn't have any data whatsoever, if I had no starting point, no conversion data, and I had a budget of $120,000, whether it's $120,000, whether it's, $10,000 or $12,000, it really doesn't matter. You're in a little bit of a different spot. And I would carve out some of that budget for branded search. So I want to make sure that you're bidding on Google AdWords, for example, or whatever platforms you're pushing, your brand name. So you're driving kind of top of funnel and or even bottom of funnel by going after branded ads. And then I would look at how I can stretch my dollars. Depending on the business that you're in, there's going to be better sources to look at. If I'm a funeral home and I'm looking to, that's going to be a digitally driven, if you're looking for people that are something that's called at need, so they have care that they need right now, that's Google AdWords all day long. Now, I might also test and run some Facebook ads, but I would put a lot of my budget towards Google. And it's just starting to take some educated guesses and assumptions based on what you know about the marketplace. I would leverage Perplexity and Claude and Gemini and ChatGPT and have it feed you some information as well. Where's my target customer? Now, the downside is right now your target customers are everywhere. They're on social media, you need to be there. They're going to your website, they're on all the different platforms, so you got to pay to play on those. It's looking at how I can stretch my dollars. But I need to make sure that I have enough traffic sources that I can start to test. You might find out that your best source is actually putting money in a church ad in the back of those bulletins. It could be the best thing that you do, and a digital marketer in me would say that's never going to work very well unless you start to test it. With no data, no budgets, I want to see a pretty broad test. I want to see online and offline channels. If events make sense, I want to see a couple of events. I want to see some print. I want to see a little bit of direct response. Postcards, oversized postcards, for example. But I want to see Facebook ads, Google ads. I want to see a content strategy. So you can start to get creative with where you allocate. But you also need to be realistic. If your budget's $12,000, for example, I don't want you to test $50 a month on Facebook and $50 on TikTok and $50 on X and $50 on Reddit. You can't get enough empirical data to make some smart decisions. So I might only test 3 or 4 if my budgets are a little bit smaller. But most of you that are listening to this podcast, you're savvy, you have some data. So the attribution model should start to be looked at. And if you don't have enough of that data, start to layer some of the additional items on so that you can start to better invest your marketing budget. And as things start to work well, amplify the budgets. Don't take away the budgets from the other sources. You want to make sure you still give those a good test, but amplify. Amplify for better results. Michael Tazzer signing off. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. I'll see you next week.